Assalamu alaikum and welcome back, everyone. This is episode 100 Sex.
Great to be here.
Today we are doing a deep dive based on the research in the book True CourtRoom Stories, researched by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir.
That's right.
And we are tackling a subject that is, well, it's universally resonant, but it's also perpetually controversial: taxation.
Always. It affects everyone, so everyone has an opinion.
Exactly. But we're not going to wade into, the usual debates about current tax rates or filing deadlines. That's not what this is about.
No.
We are undertaking a crucial, a philosophical, historical, and legal excavation to really understand the true boundaries of state power. Where does the state's inherent ability to compel revenue? Where does it hit the absolute wall of justice? And on the other side, where does the right of the citizen begin?
It's perhaps the most important question in political economy, really. And as you said, we're drawing our context today from a fascinating look at these principles.
Right, from the book.
Yes, specifically the legal research compiled there. Our focus is the core sort of non-negotiable idea of fair taxation and the mechanisms societies have developed.
Across millennia, right, and across different cultures.
Across millennia and continents, exactly, all to ensure that that raw power remains checked.
Okay, so let's unpack this mission. We got some really interesting points from our listener, the learner, all pulled from this source material.
Yeah, they seemed a bit disconnected at first glance.
They really did. We have a moral prohibition from early Islamic governance. Then you have a revolutionary slogan that basically defined modern democracy.
A very famous one.
A very famous one. Then a specific piece of contemporary constitutional law. And finally, the single philosophical ratio that you argue links them all together.
It does. It's the thread that runs through everything.
So our goal here is to connect these diverse points across time and across legal systems to reveal a single, enduring blueprint for what legitimate financial governance actually looks like.
Absolutely. We're trying to move beyond just the mechanics of taxation, the spreadsheets and the forms.
Get to its morality.
It's morality and it's legality. The overarching theme, the philosophical anchor we'll keep coming back to, is that fundamental concept from the source material.
Which is?
Revenue power is bounded by justice.
Revenue power is bounded by justice.
That singular statement, it's the bedrock. It's what any stable, free society has to be built on. If we can understand this ratio, we understand the true limits of state authority.
That concept, it does sound foundational, but let's not just glide past it. I think we need to dissect the components, starting with that first half.
Yep.
Revenue power.
Good idea.
What are we really describing when we talk about the state's financial authority?
Well, revenue power is, it's the ultimate expression of state sovereignty.
The ultimate expression.
It is. It's the inherent, unavoidable authority of the government, whatever form it takes, a monarchy, a republic, whatever, to compel its citizens and residents to contribute financially to its operations.
So the key word there is compel. This isn't a charity drive.
Not at all. This isn't voluntary fundraising. We're talking about mandatory duties, levies, fees, and taxes.
Right.
They're necessary to fund defense, administer justice, maintain infrastructure.
All the things a state does.
Exactly. And in its purest sort of theoretical form, this power is absolute. The state makes a compulsory claim on a portion of the wealth generated within its jurisdiction. Without this power, the state it just dissolves.
That's why it's so potent then. It's compulsory and it's, you said, absolute, unless constrained.
Unless constrained, that's the key.
So the only thing preventing this compulsory absolute power from becoming, oppressive tyranny is the second half of that ratio, being bounded by justice.
That's it. That's the guardrail.
This is where the ethical guardrails come up. So what are the specific facets of justice we are talking about in this very high-stakes context of state financial claims?
It's a great question, because when we say justice is bounding revenue power, we're invoking a multifaceted systemic standard. It's not about an emotional sense of what's fair.
It's not just a feeling.
No, it's a structured framework, and it's built on several key components. You have fairness, you have proportionality, equity, and procedural correctness.
Okay, hold on. Let's define proportionality and equity because I think people often confuse them, but they are critically different legal and ethical standards, especially for taxation.
A fantastic point to make. They're very different. So proportionality, it primarily deals with the rate and the scale of the burden relative to the capacity to pay.
Okay, so it's about the numbers.
It's mostly about the numbers, yes.
Yeah.
A proportional tax is one where the sacrifice required is relatively similar across the population. And you can measure that by income, wealth, consumption.
So, for instance, the debate between a flat tax and a progressive tax, that's really a debate about what's more proportional.
Exactly. Does everyone pay the same rate, say 15%? Or does everyone feel the same relative burden, where higher earners pay a higher rate so the hit feels subjectively similar to someone on a lower income?
I see.
Proportionality, at its core, ensures that the state's need doesn't bankrupt the citizen. It's a pragmatic limit.
Okay, so proportionality is like the math problem, the economic relationship between the taxpayer and the tax rate.
You could put it that way, yes. Now, equity, on the other hand, adds this layer of social morality to it.
So it's more than just the numbers.
Much more. Equity demands that those in similar financial situations should face similar burdens. That's called horizontal equity.
Okay, that makes sense.
And it also suggests the system should treat people in different circumstances appropriately, which is vertical equity. But, and this is crucial, equity also allows for specific adjustments based on the cost of living or, special circumstances.
Give me an example of that.
Sure, allowing tax deductions for having children or for high medical expenses. That isn't necessarily about strict proportionality.
Right, because two people could have the same gross income, but totally different situations.
Exactly. They have radically different family needs, so they don't have the same capacity to pay. Equity recognizes that. It says they shouldn't face the same final tax burden. It brings context into the equation.
Wow, that is a powerful distinction. Proportionality is the math problem. Equity is the context problem. And for a tax to be truly just, you're saying both have to be satisfied.
Ideally, yes. And there's a fourth component you mentioned.
The fourth one, right? Procedural correctness.
Procedural correctness.
Yeah.
This is the legal backbone of the whole thing. This mandates that the rules for collecting the tax must be clear, transparent, established in advance, and applied equally to everyone.
So no surprises.
No surprises. The state can't levy taxes secretly or arbitrarily or, crucially, retroactively. If the government tries to collect revenue outside the established legal process, even if the rate is low and the tax seems proportional,
It's still unjust.
it fails the justice test because the procedure was wrong. This protects the citizen from the whim of some official or a sudden decree from the executive. It's about the rule of law, not the rule of men.
Okay, I understand the ethical and legal boundary now. It's this whole framework. But let's go back to the fundamental why. Why must this power be limited? I mean, if the state is facing a massive crisis, an infrastructure collapse, or a war...
A defense emergency, sure.
Right. Shouldn't those practical needs override these, philosophical concerns of fairness and proportionality?
That is the perennial question, isn't it? And history gives us a very stark and, I would say, unanimous answer. No.
No.
Absolutely not. Allowing the state to override the boundary of justice for some temporary necessity is the fast track to absolute corruption and systemic failure.
Why, though? Why is it so absolute?
Because the historical risks of unchecked state financial authority aren't just, moral failings. They're not just about being mean to the taxpayer. They're economic and social self-destruction mechanisms.
Okay, elaborate on that. What does unchecked revenue power actually destroy?
First, and most importantly, it destroys the basic foundations of commerce. It destroys property rights and the incentive to invest.
How so?
Well, think about it. Why would you work hard or save or invest or innovate if the state can just arbitrarily seize the fruits of that labor at any moment?
You wouldn't. You'd hide your money.
Precisely.
Yeah.
When revenue power is unchecked, the citizenry transitions from being productive citizens to being hidden hoarders. Capital flees the country, production grinds to a halt, and what happens to the state's tax base?
It shrinks.
It shrinks rapidly. The government might grab a lot of cash in the short term, but in doing so, it destroys its long-term source of revenue. It eats its own seed corn.
That's one thing. What's the other?
Second, it leads directly to institutional tyranny and social instability. The ability to fund vast bureaucracies or secret police or huge armies with arbitrary revenue, it allows the government to oppress its own people without ever having to seek their consent or support.
Because they don't need the people's buy-in to get the money.
They don't. And this inevitably leads to a revolution or civil strife or just total economic collapse because the social contract has been fundamentally broken.
What's the social contract in this context?
It's the basic understanding that the government protects the rights and property of the people it taxes. When taxation becomes arbitrary seizure, that contract is void.
So the limit isn't some altruistic self-sacrifice by the state. It's actually a matter of economic self-preservation for the entire system.
Yes. That's it exactly. A state that respects the boundaries of justice is, paradoxically, a state that is much more likely to survive and thrive in the long run.
And this brings us back to the practical implication of our ratio.
It does. If a tax is perceived by the people as unjust, meaning it fails the test of proportionality or equity or procedure, it immediately begins to lose its moral and, crucially, its functional legitimacy.
People stop paying.
Compliance drops like a stone.
Okay.
Resistance rises. The cost of enforcement skyrockets. You have to hire more and more agents to chase less and less money.
So the line between a legitimate public contribution and illegitimate extraction, that's the difference between a functioning society and one that's, teetering on the edge of revolt.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's the difference.
This ratio, then, is like a universal operating system for legitimate governance.
Yeah.
It's the standard against which every citizen can measure every government action. Okay. We have laid the philosophical groundwork. I think it's time to see how that theory was applied in practice, long before modern constitutional courts even existed.
Let's do it. We're moving from the abstract ideal to a concrete moral instruction given to rulers.
We transition now to a powerful historical example of this boundary in action, and this is drawn from early Islamic governance. The prohibition laid down by Ali, may God be pleased with him, against excessive taxation.
Yes.
This is a limit rooted deeply in moral and religious authority, acting as a kind of governor on raw state power.
And what's so fascinating about this instruction is that it explicitly commands the ruler to prioritize the long-term well-being and the capacity of the population over the immediate fiscal need of the state.
So it's about the future, not just the present.
It speaks directly to the core of what we call substantive justice, the actual burden being imposed on people. It's a profound recognition that the source of wealth is the citizenry's productivity, not the state's coffer.
Let's delve into what excessive really meant in this context, because it feels like a concept that transcends any single religious tradition and speaks to just sound economic policy. If a tax is too high, what are the practical effects that would categorize it as excessive or unjust?
In classical jurisprudence, excessive is really defined by its destructive impact. A tax becomes excessive if the burden is disproportionate to the subject's capacity to pay, leading to genuine hardship, or if the collection practices themselves are oppressive.
Okay.
But the key indicator of injustice, according to this principle, is when the tax begins to cannibalize the source of wealth.
Cannibalize the source of wealth. Can you give me a specific example of what that looks like?
Of course. Imagine a farmer who cultivates a plot of land. The state imposes a land tax, or a kharaj, that is so high that after paying the duty, the farmer is left with insufficient seed to plant for the next season.
Or can't afford to maintain his tools.
Exactly. Not enough resources to continue cultivating the land.
Yeah.
In that moment, the tax has killed the long-term revenue stream. The ruler has sacrificed all future income from that farm for a temporary surge in present cash.
Wow.
Ali's prohibition is a direct mandate against this kind of short-sighted, destructive approach. It forces the ruler to think and act like a fiduciary, a steward of the economy's future, not just as an immediate beneficiary.
That makes this principle far more sophisticated than just a simple plea for, lower taxes. It's a structural rule for sustainable governance.
It is absolutely a structural rule, and you have to think about the historical environment this instruction was addressing. Rulers often relied on tax collectors, who were often powerful local figures, who were incentivized to extract the maximum possible revenue, regardless of the hardship it caused. They got a cut.
So their incentive was to be as harsh as possible.
The prohibition on excessive taxation served as a direct moral and legal check on the collection methodology itself, not just the prescribed rate. If the method involves undue violence or forced labor or seizing the minimal tools of production a person needs to live,
then the collection itself is unjust and therefore illicit.
Precisely. It doesn't matter what the law says the rate is. If the how is oppressive, it's wrong.
So this principle effectively sets a baseline for human dignity and economic activity. The state's claim cannot infringe upon the ability of the individual to survive and to continue being productive.
It creates a crucial floor. And this is so vital because, unlike in our modern systems where tax rates might be debated in a parliament, ancient governance often relied solely on the ruler's virtue and religious obedience.
So this wasn't just advice, it was a standard.
It provided a clear standard for scholars, for judges, and even for citizens to challenge the government's financial behavior. The injustice isn't just that the tax is high. The injustice is that it destroys the life and the capacity of the productive individual.
When we link this back to our primary ratio of revenue power is bounded by justice, Ali's prohibition becomes really the definitive historical expression of substantive justice.
It is. It is the ultimate test of the content of the policy.
Is the outcome fair? Is the burden sustainable?
It's the moral compass enforcing the boundary. And this contrasts so sharply with other regimes historically that followed the principle that the state owns everything and the citizen merely holds wealth by temporary royal permission.
Right.
This prohibition just flips that script entirely. It asserts that the individual's productive capacity is primary and the state's revenue claim is secondary, and it's conditioned upon preserving that capacity.
And the really profound part is that this instruction, which is rooted in 7th century governance, resonates perfectly with modern economic theories of sustainable growth and capacity building.
It's timeless economic wisdom.
Okay, so we've seen the limit applied in a moral context, focusing on the substance of the tax burden. Now, let's pivot to a totally different type of limit, one focused entirely on the procedure of its imposition.
We transition now from a morally or, religiously mandated limit to a procedurally and politically driven limit that truly became the engine of the age of revolutions.
And this is the global rallying cry we all know.
No taxation without representation.
This slogan is just pure political power. It's so concise, it's memorable, and it's entirely focused on legitimacy. The tax rate itself almost becomes secondary to the question of who has the right to impose it.
Precisely. This slogan fundamentally reframed the entire concept of state power. It shifts the discussion away from the question of is this tax burden too high to by whose authority is this burden being placed upon me?
And that's the moment that fiscal power becomes inextricably linked to democratic consent.
It is. The injustice being challenged here is not economic, not really. It is procedural exclusion.
Let's analyze the political philosophy that's underlying this. Why does a lack of representation fundamentally render a tax unjust, even if the tax is, say, very low?
Well, it goes back to the core concept of property rights and the social contract. Philosophers like John Locke argue that the primary reason individuals even form a civil society is to protect their property.
Okay, protection of property is goal number one.
Goal number one. So if the government, the very entity that's charged with protecting your property, can arbitrarily seize portions of that property through taxes without the owner's consent,
then the government has violated the entire contract.
it has violated the fundamental reason for its existence. The absence of consent is what transforms taxation from a legitimate public duty into theft or plunder.
That is exactly the revolutionary argument, isn't it?
It is. When the British Parliament was taxing the American colonies, the colonial argument wasn't just about the shillings and the pence. It was about status.
Status. How so?
Their argument was, if you tax us, you must treat us as full political members of the realm, entitled to a voice in the parliament that levies the tax. If you deny us the voice, you deny your own right to tax.
So the denial of representation implied a lesser sort of subject status, which they rejected.
They completely rejected it. It was an assertion of political equality.
This procedural limit, it requires a very specific institutional architecture to work. What exactly does representation demand in terms of how a state functions?
It demands legislative supremacy in all financial matters. Full stop. It requires that the power to levy taxes must reside exclusively in a body, a parliament, a congress, an assembly, whose members are either elected by, or at least accountable to, the population being taxed.
And that process, that forces everything out into the open.
It forces transparency, debate, and deliberation. The tax measure has to be publicly proposed, it has to be argued over, and it has to be approved by the collective will, rather than just being decreed by the executive authority, the king or the prime minister's office.
That is a massive transfer of power when you think about it. It's shifting the authority to tax away from the sovereign's personal prerogative and putting it into the people's collective will.
And so the birth of modern democracy, in many ways, it institutionalizes the concept of accountability.
How?
Because if the taxes are unpopular or they're unjust, the representatives who voted for them can be removed by the electorate at the next election. This direct link between fiscal policy and electoral consequence is the procedural check that prevents arbitrary rule.
So by making taxation dependent on representation, societies enforce the boundary of justice through a mechanism.
Through a mechanism, yes. Through procedural justice.
Okay, so if the historical limit laid down by Ali was the moral test of fairness, the substance, this global limit is the political test of legitimacy, the procedure.
And both are expressions of that same primary ratio.
They're two sides of the same justice coin, then.
They absolutely are. A tax might be substantively fair, low rate for a good purpose, but if it is enacted without representation, it is procedurally unjust and therefore illegitimate.
And the reverse could be true.
Conversely, a tax could be enacted by a perfectly representative body, but be so cripplingly high that it violates the substantive justice principle we talked about earlier. Both checks are absolutely necessary for a system to be fair.
We've tracked this principle from a moral instruction to a political revolution. Now let's see how these ideals are hardened, how they're codified into the contemporary legal framework, moving into the highly technical area of constitutional law.
We turn now to the modern mechanism for enforcing this boundary of justice, specific codified law. And our source material points specifically to Pakistan's Article 77.
Right.
In the context of contemporary constitutional states, provisions like Article 77 are what translate those moral and political principles we've been discussing into specific, legally binding, and importantly, judicially enforceable rules.
Because the modern state can't just rely on the virtuous intention of its leaders.
No.
Or the constant threat of revolution to keep things in line. It needs clear legal barriers. So Article 77 is presented here as the legal manifestation of our primary ratio, specifically within the Pakistani constitutional context.
And the function of an article like 77 is absolutely central to a functioning democracy. It ensures that the state's revenue power operates strictly under the rule of law. And while we don't need to read the full text, we can analyze the critical legal functions this type of article performs globally and link them back to the principles we've discussed.
Okay, so what is the most critical function of a constitutional article that limits taxing power?
The first, and I would say the most foundational, is ensuring legislative mandate.
Legislative mandate.
Yes. Article 77 typically mandates something like, no tax shall be levied for the purposes of the Federation except by or under the authority of an act of Parliament. This is the legal codification of no taxation without representation.
It's the slogan written into law.
It is. It means the executive branch, the administrative power of the government, is completely stripped of the independent authority to just invent new taxes. Any tax must originate, be debated, and pass through the full legislative process.
So it's the legal check that prevents that sudden, arbitrary financial decree of a monarch or an executive cabinet that we talked about.
Exactly. But it actually does more than just require an act. It establishes technical safeguards that reinforce that procedural justice. For example, constitutional tax provisions often require what are called money bills to originate in the lower house of the legislature.
And why is that significant?
Because the lower house is generally seen as the body that most closely represents the populace, the people's house. So this technical rule reinforces that democratic accountability. The money conversation has to start with the people's direct representatives.
Okay, that covers the procedure. But how do constitutional articles like 77 provide a technical check against substantive injustice, against those excessive or unfair taxes? How does the law itself police proportionality and equity?
This is where the judiciary comes in as the ultimate gatekeeper. While the legislature has the primary right to create a tax, the constitutional article provides the legal standard for judicial review.
Okay.
So when a citizen challenges a tax act passed by Parliament, the court doesn't just check if the right procedure was followed. It also applies constitutional tests of fairness to the substance of the law.
What do those judicial tests actually look like in practice?
Well, the courts often apply a concept called reasonable classification.
Reasonable classification.
It's a judicial test of equity and proportionality. If a tax law treats different groups of people or different economic activities differently, the government must be able to demonstrate that this classification is reasonable.
And what does reasonable mean to a court?
It means it has to have a rational relationship to a legitimate government purpose. For instance, if the government decides to tax one industry at 20% and a very similar industry at only 5%, the court will demand a rational justification for that differential treatment.
And if there isn't one?
If the classification is found to be arbitrary or discriminatory or confiscatory, if it violates those core principles of proportionality or equity, the court can strike down the act.
Even though it was passed by Parliament?
Even though it was passed by a democratically elected Parliament, that's the real power of codification. It takes those philosophical ideas, proportionality, equity, and it turns them into actual grounds for legal invalidation.
So if the government violates Article 77, it's not just a moral failing anymore, it's a legal violation, and that allows the judiciary to intervene.
And we also see the legal enforcement of other principles, like clarity and non-retrospectivity. Constitutional provisions usually dictate that tax laws must be clear enough for the average citizen to understand their obligations. That upholds procedural fairness.
You can't be held to a law you can't understand.
Exactly. And furthermore, the principle of non-retrospectivity, the idea that new taxes can't generally be imposed on transactions that happened before the law was passed, is a critical defense against arbitrary financial surprise.
So Article 77, in its function, acts as a filter that the legislature has to pass its ideas through. And then the resulting tax law remains subject to the judiciary's review using these core principles of justice as their yardstick.
That's a perfect summary. It acts as the synthesized product of centuries of struggle. The battles fought over consent, which was our Section 3, and over excessive burdens from Section 2 are all summarized and enforced through this single modern legal framework.
Yes, the whole package.
If a tax is legally enacted via the process in Article 77 and it survives these judicial tests of reasonable classification, then it is deemed to have satisfied the boundary of justice in the modern state. This structured process protects the citizen from ambiguity, from executive overreach, and from discriminatory policy.
This is where the deep dive really pays off. We've moved beyond just summarizing 4 points and have shown how they function dynamically. The philosophical ratio demands a limit.
Ali defines the limit substantively.
The revolutionaries define it procedurally.
And Article 77 codifies the enforcement mechanism.
Right. Now let's synthesize these 3 manifestations of justice.
Let's bring it all together.
Here is the core insight for you, the learner. We've identified 3 fundamentally different sources of authority: a religious tradition, a political movement, and constitutional law. And they are all converging on the single truth that revenue power is bounded by justice. The tools are different, but the goal is the unification of state power and ethical governance.
This universality is, I think, the most powerful takeaway. Every society, regardless of its foundation, has to find a way to manage this inescapable tension.
What tension is that?
The tension between the state's need to exist and the citizens' right to their property and their livelihood. And the successful solutions that societies have come up with consistently fall into these 3 categories of justice.
Okay, let's map them explicitly one final time just to make it crystal clear.
Let's do it. So Ali's prohibition is the expression of substantive justice. It asks the core question: is the outcome of this tax oppressive? Is the burden excessive? This is the moral check on the state's potentially voracious appetite.
Okay, that's one. Then we have the global slogan, no taxation without representation.
And that is the expression of procedural justice. It asks a different question. Was this measure enacted with the consent and the participation of the governed? This is the democratic check on arbitrary rule.
And finally, Article 77's function.
That is the expression of codified justice. It asks, was the tax enacted strictly legally via the established legislative body? And does it survive judicial review against constitutional standards like reasonable classification? This is the legal check that provides actual recourse for the individual citizen.
This is where the framework becomes truly useful for analyzing things today. What happens when these 3 types of justice clash? Can a tax be legal, satisfying codified justice, but still be unjust, failing the substantive justice test?
Absolutely. And that is the enduring problem of governance. A government operating under a provision like Article 77 passes a tax bill with all the proper procedure.
So procedural and codified justice are satisfied. Check, check.
Check, check. However, due to unforeseen economic shifts, say a hyperinflation crisis or a deep recession, that tax, though legally enacted, becomes so crippling to the middle class that it is effectively excessive and destructive to the economy.
So it fails the substantive test.
In that scenario, the law fails the test of substantive justice. The legal framework must then be challenged and adapted, because the tax, though constitutional in its form, has become oppressive in its function.
The ultimate check, then, must always be the substantive one. Even the most perfectly crafted legal system is only a tool, and if that tool starts producing oppression, the tool itself must be adjusted.
Correct. The law is supposed to serve justice, not the other way around. The endurance of that foundational ratio, that power must be bounded by justice, is universal, precisely because it addresses the basic human need for security against arbitrary seizure.
It's what makes it governance instead of just force.
It transforms tax collection from a mere exercise of force into a legitimate and hopefully mutually beneficial contribution to society.
So this framework provides a comprehensive toolkit for you, the learner. You now have a layered approach to analyzing any tax policy, or any revenue measure that might be introduced by your government.
The deep dive takeaway framework for critical analysis is really this three-part test you can apply.
Let's lay it out. First, the legal check, codified justice.
Right. Was this tax enacted strictly by an act of Parliament, following all the established constitutional procedure as required by mechanisms like Article 77? If not, it's invalid and it's ripe for a judicial challenge.
Okay, that's the first hurdle. Second, the procedural check, procedural justice.
Did the tax pass through a body where the payers had a democratic voice? Does the government possess the current consent of the governed to impose this specific burden? Is it legitimate?
And finally, what you called the highest bar, the substantive check, substantive justice.
Is the tax oppressive, excessive, or discriminatory in its effect? Does it violate those principles of proportionality and equity by destroying the economic capacity of the people, or by treating similarly situated people arbitrarily?
So if a measure fails any one of these three tests,
If it fails any one of them, it has crossed the boundary set by our foundational ratio,
Right.
it ceases to be fair taxation, and it becomes an illegitimate claim on the citizens' resources. And that, historically, is what initiates a struggle between the power of the state and the rights of the individual.
and what we've really learned today is that these three checks aren't just random historical artifacts. They are integrated structural solutions to the single enduring problem of state financial power.
That's the key takeaway.
What a monumental journey, seriously. We took four seemingly disparate concepts from a single source: a philosophical ratio, a historical religious instruction, a revolutionary political slogan, and a contemporary legal article, and we synthesized them into a universal framework for legitimate governance.
It's quite remarkable how they all fit together.
It really is. It's all centered around that single, unavoidable truth. Revenue power is bounded by justice.
And this deep dive, it gives you not just a list of facts, but a real tool for critical engagement with your government. It also underscores the fragility of justice in this realm.
Oh, so?
Well, if revenue power is fundamentally bounded by justice, and justice is not a static concept, if it shifts with new technologies, new economic realities, new social needs, then how often must the specific legal boundaries, the constitutional articles and the acts, be reassessed?
That's a great question.
If the government holds on to a procedurally perfect tax law that has become substantively destructive in a modern context, does the legal system have a duty to self-correct? Or does it risk perpetuating a kind of codified injustice?
That is the perpetual challenge facing every modern state, isn't it? The need for legal flexibility in the face of unchanging ethical demands. It's a powerful note for you, the listener, to mull over as you engage with your own governance.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the limits of revenue power. We'll be back soon with more insights, always striving to connect the historical principles to your contemporary world.